morning, everyone, and especially you, Christopher Luxon. Thank you very, very much for giving up your time. I know how pressured and how little time you have, but we really do appreciate you coming on here this morning, Christopher. So thank you.
Great to be with you.
Yeah. Hey, just, having such a tight schedule made me think about how much your life has changed from that corporate busy life now to a busy politician. So how's it all transpired as far as juggling time goes, for a start?
I mean, I've always been pretty good with time, and I've had some pretty extreme jobs in my past life as well. And so, when I was overseas a lot, I was often quite normal for me to be, going home, doing bath time with the kids at 6 o'clock on a Monday, and then heading to London that night, and then arriving into London for a board meeting, and then heading home later on that day to get back and use the time zone. So, so I'm quite used to that. I'm always an early riser, and sort of get to the office before 7, and then go for it. And then in Parliament, just on Tuesday, Wednesdays, we obviously stay there till sort of 11 o'clock and sometimes midnight. But no, that part of it's not that dissimilar to my past life, really. It's just discipline on time and how you use your 24 hours in a day. And it's the same thing, like if you get really clear on the big stuff that really matters and the big goals that are moving things forward, and don't let you get distracted by all the other minutiae, and fill your time up with sort of stuff that's not making a big difference. That's the key thing, really.
Oh, that's great. Hey, I hope you don't mind, but our normal format is people can put questions into the chat box, and hopefully, I know, again, with that limited time that we've got for us this morning, we can maybe get a few of those questions through to you. So anyone that has questions, just type them in and we'll see if we can do it. Let's get it underway, Christopher. Obviously, this is all about the real estate market. That's what we're about. So can I get a feel from you what you see the next 12 months might be in real estate, not just obviously Auckland, but the whole of New Zealand as well?
Yeah, look, I think the challenge is that, the real estate market's been propelled by very low interest rates and high levels of government spending and an overheated economy. And essentially, if you just take a step back and say what's been going on, is that you've had a government with government spending that's been unprecedented, like we've never seen before in this country. To give you a feel for it, that budget that came out in May was about $9.5 billion of incremental new spending, on top of a government that now is spending $51 billion more than it did 4 or 5 years ago. And the problem is that we're spending more money, hiring more bureaucrats, getting worse outcomes, but all that government spending in an economy that's been constrained with borders shut down, coupled with a Reserve Bank and monetary policy, making low interest rates and printing money, all of that has just created huge fuel on an inflation fire. And so the Prime Minister will say, oh, look, inflation's global. Well, the reality is probably half of it is and half of it isn't. Half of it's domestic, and it's been exacerbated by that accelerator being full on with the government spending. And now the Reserve Bank is trying to wrest control back and apply the brakes with higher levels of interest rates. But you've got the Reserve Bank putting the brakes on, the government still putting the accelerator on. And all of that is not a good outlook, because essentially interest rates are going to have to rise. And as you've seen, the OCR at 3 and the Reserve Bank talking about it being another point or point and a half higher, certainly 4% through 2023. So there's still a wee way to go and a bit of a correction to happen.
Yeah, I guess you touched on a few points there that I wanted to raise with you as well. Obviously, the Reserve Bank fighting inflation with raising interest rates, but then if a lot of the inflation is imported inflation, how effective is those interest rates going to be on inflation?
Yeah, well, as I said, half of it you could explain as imported or international inflation, I reckon. Things like COVID, the oil shocks, the war in Ukraine, the retreat of globalization, all of those kinds of factors contributing to it. And yes, there's not much we can do about that per se. But the bit that we can control is government spending, and the bit we can control is monetary policy settings here in New Zealand. And I think on both those counts, that's been my message from when I became the leader, is just you're looking at those amber sort of dashes, lights on the dash. And I remember saying, even within the first few weeks, is look, the cost of living crisis is real. It's going to start biting, and that the option set gets worse and uglier as time goes by if you don't address it. And so, there's just a lot of dumb and wasteful spending going on in this country by the government. On the other hand, you've heard former Reserve Bank governors and and officials come out and say, hey, listen, we just stimulated the economy for way too long, and that's why we've wanted sort of an independent inquiry. So at least we get the learning from that experience to say, look, yep, probably necessary early on in COVID 2020. Ultimately, I think around the world, people have misread COVID as a demand-driven problem, a bit like the GFC, rather than a supply-side-driven problem, which has been more of what it's turned out to be. And as a consequence, we piled a heap of cash into New Zealand, probably just proportionately just behind the US. And so, we fortunately don't have the challenges of Europe with respect to energy prices, which is really what's driving their inflation. And people can say, oh, we're doing better relative to other countries, but they've got a rather unique set of circumstances in Europe at the moment. But, again, when government spending's up $51 billion, I think it's up almost 68% or something, and you've got a doubling of the debt, all because of, and at a time you're putting a lot of fire, a lot of fuel on the inflation fires, I'd say. So,
yeah.
So I think those two things, you could ask some really genuine questions about, did we keep the settings in place for way too long? And more importantly, I just think, I can see what's happening. We've hired 14,000 more bureaucrats in 4 years in Wellington, at $2 billion extra per year in costs. And have we had a better set of outcomes delivered? Absolutely not.
Yeah. I guess I'd like to pose a question to you. Prior to the big inflation impact that we had, there was a lot of calls for government to control house prices and values and the way the market was going.
Oops, you're frozen there, I think, Len.
What's your thoughts around that? What's your thoughts? What's your feel around that?
Sorry, I think you cut out there on me a little bit, but I think I get the gist of the question, which is the core issue that we've got in the housing market in New Zealand is around housing supply, land supply, right? And, if you think about it, we're in a country the size of Great Britain and Japan with a lot less people and more expensive house prices. So a lot of it comes back to access to capital in this market, which is, and we're probably the second most restrictive in the OECD with respect to foreign direct investment. But the other big piece is really around land supply, and a lot of that's to do with infrastructure funding and how we finance urban infrastructure. And the second part really is around planning systems and our planning processes, which are pretty abysmal. And so when you see a doubling of resource consents, when you see a hospital that has bought the land next door in Epsom, and it's really being held up by one person taking them to the court. That all just says this isn't a place where we make it easy for ourselves to get things built and get things done and get things moving. So I think those are the big challenges really that New Zealand still faces is, we have plenty of land. We just aren't land supply, and therefore supply of houses is the problem.
Mm. I guess that your response leads me to the hot topic of today. Front page of the Herald, big problems around the intensification of our cities. Obviously, there's a bipartisan central government policy there to bring on that, and yet we're seeing councils pushing back. What's your feel about that? What's your thoughts around that? How are we doing the right thing there?
Yeah, well, look, again, if you just zoom out, what's New Zealand's biggest problem? The problem is that we have a productivity disease in this country over the last 30 years under successive governments, is that we have not been able to create a fundamentally wealthier economy. And so New Zealanders are working for an hour to earn what an Australian earns in 45 minutes. We work something more like 9 weeks more than the average Brit, I think 390 hours a year more, because our incomes, because we have to work longer and harder to get the income that we need, because we haven't been able to create an economy that actually drives into higher value products and services, and therefore higher GDP per capita, essentially. So that's the guts of New Zealand's problem. And so when you then drill back as what are the challenges? Well, one is you've got to have a world-class education system. You have to have great infrastructure. You really need to embrace technology and research and development more. Definitely need to have a more pro-business environment and ultimately international connections. And that's what makes other small advanced economies like Denmark, Ireland, Israel, Singapore, Switzerland much wealthier than New Zealand, is they've got those underpinnings to what they're doing. So one of them is certainly an infrastructure. And productivity is certainly much greater in cities. And so, the feeling is that if you double population of a city, you can get a 15% improvement in productivity because you get all that scale and all that agglomeration that sort of is happening. So it is a combination of needing to have more density within our cities, but also more greenfields expansion as well. It's an and, not an or. But, you know, as you saw, I lived in Sydney in the mid-90s, and I watched, you know, where I lived in Crow's Nest, St. Leonard's, build up and densify around a, you know, transport hub. If you think about areas like Panmure here in Auckland, you know, that's exactly what should be happening as they become very vibrant areas, attract young people into it. Amanda and I had a 2-bedroom apartment there. Then they built high rises, the shopping precinct followed, the cafe society followed, and they became very dynamic sort of areas of a city that previously was single dwelling sort of buildings, right? So there's a you know, we do have to acknowledge that we've got to densify our cities if we're going to, and we need to, because that also does drive scale benefits, and cities are highly productive units, and it's a good way of improving productivity. We also do need to open up and consent land better than we've been doing as well. And I think, you know, the bill that is in place has these things called qualifying matters that are for the discretion of councils to determine. As to the issue today, because we don't see the legal advice, it's difficult for me to comment too much on that. But, you know, suffice to say, I thought, you know, the balance was there was enough flexibility in there to consider things like heritage or infrastructure concerns of overloading or other things that, you know, are legitimate concerns about why you wouldn't want to do densification in some spaces.
Yeah. Okay. I guess that leads me to find out where your thoughts are around home ownership, because there's so much data coming out that New Zealand, I think it's trending all over the world, but New Zealand has a significant issue coming with home ownership. People aren't able to buy the homes that they want, and all this is starting to push forward into what we can see now as an aging population as well, where people are in a situation where they're renting, they're retiring, they're going on to superannuation as a form of income, and they can't even afford the rents, and have no equity in a property or whatever to fall back on. What's your thoughts around that? Because personally, I see it as a major issue for this country coming up.
Yeah, I mean, we think we're a party that believes in home ownership, because when you own your own home, you get invested in your local community, you care about the local school, you make a commitment to your neighbours and into the street that you're in, you care about local government. So home ownership is just a great thing. You know, it's a really good thing. But you're right. I mean, we've got 4 parts to this housing market, and they sort of all end up interrelating, right? I mean, the average house price has gone up $400,000 under this government to over $1 million. So you're right, it's become unaffordable. There's work that we could be doing there around help to buy schemes. People seem to be able to afford, you know, rents are high, but they have difficulty getting the capital together. We've obviously got to get this land supply thing unlocked and get the financing of infrastructure and councils and all that stuff that sort of unlocks all of that value. Apartments are a way through for younger people, you know, to move into still maintain city living, but in apartments. But yeah, home ownership is a big deal. The problem with that is then if you can't own a home, you end up going to the rental market. Rents are up $140 a week at the moment, you know, $7,500 to rent the same house you had 4 years ago. And there's a whole bunch of disincentives that have been very unhelpful: bright line test extension, interest deductibility, things that we'd remove immediately, because we think that's added $40 a week to rents, you know, and made that unaffordable. When you can't buy or rent, you end up going on a state housing list. That's up 4 times to 27,000 people waiting for a state house. When you can't get a state house, you end up in emergency accommodation or in a car or in a homeless situation. So, you know, and so there's a lot we could be doing around using community housing providers a lot more. The Australians do that quite well. I mean, they probably have, I remember thinking it was close to 30% of their, you know, markets provided by community housing providers. In our case, it's just over 10, I think. So getting capital to people like the Salvation Army or Māori property trusts who want to build properties, build communities, put pastoral care elements in, that's all good stuff. We should be doing that as well. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it all comes back to home ownership. And the question is, what more can we do? But a lot of that comes back to land supply and infrastructure and our planning system.
You've certainly touched on a lot of the topics that I wanted to talk to you about there, as far as you know, bright line and all that sort of thing. We've got a significant property management part to our business, and we've just seen a lot of investors get out of the market. Some because the values were at a peak and really a good timing on that respect, but a lot of them because of the massive costs that have been dumped on them over recent times. And you know, from our perspective, if they are getting out of the market and they're not being replaced in anywhere near the numbers of new investors coming in, if they're getting out of the market, is the government going to be in a position to supply the houses? You've made a little comment there. You might want to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like, I mean, this government's hit the landlord market and said they're all evil property speculators, right? And it's nothing further from the truth, because I think about 72% of all landlords are actually, you know, mum and dad investors who own one or two rental properties. You know, it's I ran into a deputy principal at a school who, you know, she'd saved hard and her mum had recently died. And so she'd used some of that deposit to get into a rental property to augment her superannuation. That's a very typical situation. So, you know, but there's no doubt about it, you know, extending the bright line from 2 to 10 years is a stealth capital gains tax. And the second piece is removing interest deductibility, which is a legitimate business cost and expense all around the world by any accounting measure, is nuts. And I also think there's been a reweighting of law between tenant and landlord as well, which is a big disincentive too. So those three elements are the things that we want to fix immediately, because we sort of feel there's at least $40, and the full effects of the bright line and interest deductibility haven't been fully felt yet, but they are coming through as we cycle past the year mark. And you'll start to see, you know, I reckon it's about $40 a week that's been added into rents as a consequence of that. So if you're serious, you need a private rental market working really well, because it's actually because they can't get rentals, that's how they end up going into state houses or on that wait list. So there's a lot more for us to do in that regard. I also think there's a lot more around rent to build, you know, products that we could be bringing in. New Zealand uniquely over the next few years, for the first time, other countries have been in this position for a long time, but you know, we'll have some domestic pools of capital with all those KiwiSaver funds. And so, you know, having ventures where people can actually do, you know, like we see overseas, proper rent to build projects where you build a building that, you know, lasts 100 years and you get a guaranteed return, you know, 6% or more from it, or whatever it'll end up being, you know, will be attractive to some of those funds that need to be invested.
Yeah. I guess our industry is so heavily linked with the construction side of the economy as well. So, and they've got their own issues, their own problems with some of its immigration restrictions on workers coming in, skilled workers that are really needed in that industry. Have you guys got any sort of plans around that to make work that better for us?
Yeah, really important industry. I mean, you know, I think it employs something like 300,000 people. It's 9% of GDP. 1 out of 8 firms in New Zealand are actually, you know, building and construction firms. I think it's generating about $30 billion worth of our GDP. But worryingly, 120 building and construction companies have gone to the wall this year already. And so, and with the triple CFA, the financing changes that were made, which were just terrible, you know, intended to shut down on payday lenders, but actually in predatory lenders, but ended up capturing people wanting to buy their first home, and, you know, with banks trapping banks into having to go through quite a lot of convoluted criteria, but also stopping, you know, some developers getting access to cash and as well. That's been a real problem. So, and the thing I'd say is that, you know, with the cyclical nature of the boom bust, we've gone through quite a boom, but now as we come off all the stimulatory spending, both from the Reserve Bank and, you know, hopefully from the government in due course, but certainly the Reserve Bank, all of a sudden you end up in the bust cycle. And it's also exacerbated by the fact that our planning cycles and our resource planning and consenting, as I said, has doubled in 10 years. So you end up consenting a project or starting a project in the boom part of the cycle, and the consent doesn't come through until the bust part, and it just accentuates it more. We lose people out of the sector who end up going to other places like Australia, and it becomes very, very challenging. So, you know, really they're dealing with several issues. They've got massive amounts of uncertainty because there is no future pipeline or master plan, essentially, of what the projects and infrastructure kind of projects are. There's some real challenges, as I said, around consenting and our planning system, which is, really if you were coming here from another country, from Ireland or from Denmark or from Singapore, you just sit there and go, why have we chosen to organise ourselves in that way? There's a lot more opportunity, I think, for new product innovation and also things like prefabrication as well, which we've talked about for a long time here in New Zealand, but we love our custom homes. But actually, it's good to see there's a fledgling prefabrication market starting to build, like you'd see in other parts of the world as well. So, yes, there's got to be a lot of change coming into the sector and into the industry, but those are some of the big issues and challenges that we've got there.
You touch on a lot of great points there. Just one that I didn't hear you talk about, and maybe you did, but the supply issue. That's a massive influencer on the construction side, and that flows through into our industry, of course. Is that starting to show signs of easing, or where are we at with that?
You mean with respect to workforce planning?
Yeah, for future construction, are they able to say with any sort of hope that supply issues, whether it be materials coming in from overseas or whatever, are they starting to get into a better position for that?
I've started to hear that, some of the supply chain issues are starting to be solved, and that actually people have looked at the cost of containers coming down slightly. But, there's still huge opportunity there, right? I mean, our building supply is part of our market, which contributes to higher pricing and slow development, is a real challenge. I mean, that's why we've had this saying on this plasterboard piece. Andrew Bailey's put together a members bill a while ago just to say, look, if it's good enough in the US and Britain, and it meets the Australasian standard, why can't we import that into here? It does amaze me. We sit down here with 5 million people. We have over 80 BCAs, who have views on the building codes across the whole of New Zealand. Well, most countries our size would have one, to put it too fine a point on it. And so we choose to take simple things and make them horribly complex in this country. And when I look at, 400 million people living in North America and the US and Canada, they seem to build houses. They seem to be able to use plasterboard pretty effectively. If it's good enough there, it should be good enough to be able to be imported straight into New Zealand. So that whole brands piece around products and registration and, we're a small country. We're not doing something that unique down here. Yes, we have some different geography and conditions, but it's not that different from Japan. It's not that different from other parts of the world. So, I think there's a lot that could be freed up there that would sooner improve the material supply piece of it as well. I do think the reality for all businesses across New Zealand is that, and around the world, is that you end up building a bit more local resilience rather than cheapest globally sourced product, because COVID and oil prices and wars have shown us you can't always get what you need from overseas like we used to over the last 20 years. So there's a need for us to do a little bit more of that. And then on the workforce side, that's a major problem. This government has been anti-immigration from before it even came to power. If you remember the funny sounding Chinese names, that kind of debate and conversation. And they have a view fundamentally that actually an immigrant takes a job away from a Kiwi. Well, the reality is, since these guys have come to power, there's now 50,000 more people on the job seeker unemployment benefit, 50,000 more Kiwis on unemployment benefit at a time of record low unemployment and lots of vacancies in every sector in every region of this country. So, we need immigration settings to be opened up big time, and they haven't been. And that's really important that it is, because all sectors are crying out for it, and businesses aren't maximising the opportunities that they've got, because they end up playing safe because the rules keep changing and they can't make the investments they want to make or grow their businesses. And so they just keep it within a size, but they're not growing or being as productive as they can be.
Christopher, I heard you touch on the CCCFA before. I think it's been the biggest handbrake on first home buyers and young families trying to get into the market that I've seen in 30 years of being in this business. What's your thoughts towards, if you were in power around that? Would you change?
Yeah, big time. I mean, we've gone to the government actually and said, look, your intention of cutting down on predatory payday lenders, which is what we were led to believe was the objective of that legislation, and then how it was ultimately drafted. And all the feedback that was given through what's called the select committee process, where a bill goes through several readings and the public gets to consult on it and experts get to consult on it and banks made submissions on it. it was pretty clear they went the wrong way. And what we proposed was just look, in the interest of just quickly getting this thing moving, let's go to Parliament next week, pass an amendment that just excuses the major banks from the CCCFA, because they've got, you've caught the wrong lenders, right? And as a result, everyone now can't get a loan with the main banks anyway, so they go to secondary banks and they end up with the bad lenders anyway. So it's just a classic case, and you see it with this government all the time, whether it's wetland legislation, whether it's this, where there's, you know, sort of an intention, whether it's good or not, who knows, but it ends up being just really sloppy and just poorly executed. It has all these unintended consequences or intended consequences. But I now think, you know, given how simple it would be to fix it so that we could keep the thing unblocked and keep the country moving, you know, we literally could go into Parliament next week under urgency, pass a very simple amendment that at least just excludes the other mainstream banks, the 18 big banks that are regulated through the RBNZ anyway. Let's exclude them and get them moving, and then you can take more time to think about how you solve the problem that you were trying to solve. But again, a lot of this, I get very frustrated. I know I'm new to it, but in the 18 months that I've been there, you see these constant solutions in search of a problem, right? They're not well-defined problems, and therefore, you know, they don't, you know, you go kill oil and gas. Well, okay, we're now importing 2.5 times more coal into this country than we did in any year in a national government. You know, you end up making wetlands legislation. So a culvert that has some water that creates a wetland now becomes a problem for a farmer. You see the CCCFA stuff get thrown in to supposedly to cut down on payday lenders and predatory loans, but actually captures a whole bunch of property developers, but also first-time buyers, as you say, and the mainstream banks. And they're caught by that regulation. They're told to do that. They have to do that. They don't have a choice. So it's just dumb, some of the stuff. It's not practical. It's not pragmatic. It's not, you know, workable. And that's the stuff we've got to cut through.
Christopher, really mindful of your time here. I'd like to sort of close with a question. If you were to win power next year, what would be your priority changes in relation to us? I know you've got a huge amount that you probably have to think about as far as the whole economy, the whole country goes, but as far as our industry, and let's bring in construction as well, what would you see as the priorities to change as soon as you get in, basically?
The fundamental problem, at the root cause of all the stuff that we've talked about today is really around land supply. And there's two parts to that. One is actually, how do you finance urban infrastructure? And that's the relationship between central and local government and financing of infrastructure. And the second piece around that is the planning system, which frankly is unacceptable. You know, when people are taking as long as they are to do resource consents, or councils are. So those are the two things that you'd sort of, under that grouping of land supply, that you really have to go to work on and break up and sort out very, very quickly, because, and I think there's lots of ways through those things. You know, the way I look at how things are done in New South Wales versus New Zealand on the planning system, there's, you know, there's a lot that we're just going to have to do, because we need to have a really clear sense of what the master plan is on infrastructure. We need to know clearly how we're going to finance it. We need to have regulation that enables it, not blocks it, that gets in the way of stuff. And then we've got to get on and actually get it done. So yeah, it's really land supply, and there's two components to that, really: financing urban infrastructure and reviewing our planning system. And I don't want that to be code for what we're doing, which is, you know, in this country, you know, you just remember John F. Kennedy said, let's go to the moon. And 9.5 years later, people landed on the moon. So sorting out planning systems, sorting out delivery of key infrastructure, you know, when it's taking us 26 years to do a busway from Panmure to Botany, 6.5 kilometres, that's not world-class behaviour. That's something we're choosing to do it to ourselves to make it more complicated than it needs to be. It was really interesting to me, Christchurch earthquake. You know, we had a lack of supply of homes. We had more demand. We came in over the top with emergency powers. In 2.5 years, we built Rolleston and north of Rangiora, around Rangiora Way. Good amenities, great suburbs, good infrastructure. So we know we can do it. And house prices went up 2% a year in Christchurch, not 10% like the rest of the country. So, you know, we just have to be quite brutal about coming in and looking at it with fresh eyes and saying, look, why do we do it the way we've been doing it? And we want outcomes here. We're ruthlessly obsessed on outcomes. And so that's the size of the prize, because outcomes is what changes people's daily lives. It's not all the other, how much money you spend, how many people you hire, all that stuff.
Thank you. I guess you touched on it a little bit earlier, but could I ask again, would you give the changing of the tax on interest rates a priority if you were to get in power as quick?
Yeah,
as well?
assume that that's happening, mate, day one. So, basically there's three components to that. One, remove the bright line test back to 2 years, just so we manage the flipping situation as we were doing. I think secondarily, restore interest deductibility. That is a legitimate business expense. It's outrageous. It's not a tax loophole, as the Prime Minister is prone to say. It's not nothing like that at all. It's a legitimate business expense. And then thirdly, we'd want to come back and revisit those laws between landlord and tenant and say, have we got that balance right? But the first two are things that we'd be looking to do immediately. Yeah.
Well, Christopher, once again, thank you very, very much. I think you've escaped without any questions. So I think that means that you've answered a lot of questions without
or stunned people into silence.
Yeah,
sleep. I'm so sorry.
No. I think I just really appreciate you coming on board this morning and giving us that insight to your thoughts and what we could expect in the future if you were to win power. Really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll talk again soon in the near future.
Oh, listen, look, thanks for the opportunity to chat with you briefly. And all I just say to everyone is, look, we have the best country on planet Earth. It's an amazing place, New Zealand, but we are going in the wrong direction. We need to get it turned around and sorted out. We can do that together, and I think we'll get to a great place. So we've got a lot of potential to realise in this great country of ours, and I know we can do it, but we've just got to go to work.
I agree. So, thanks, Christopher.
See you guys. Take care.
Bye.